It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Patrick T. Reardon. Patrick T. Reardon. And the T is very important because we discovered, Patrick has certainly, and we've shared this, that there is another Patrick H. Reardon who is also an author, talks on some of the same topics that Patrick does, happens to be a Greek Orthodox bishop. Patrick is not. So there are two different Patricks. Our Patrick is an essayist, a poet, a book critic, and a Chicago historian. And during his spare time, which I'm kidding, he has none, left over from his multifaceted labors of love, Patrick worked as a Chicago Tribune reporter for 32 years. So I'm sure all of us have seen lots of stories Patrick's been part of. But now he is the author of 10 books, including the one he is sharing with us today. We're very grateful for that. All our speakers are volunteers. They don't get paid for this, but they share their experience and the wonderfulness of what they've done with us. And it's just terrific. Okay. His book that he's sharing is The Loop, the L tracks that shaped and saved Chicago. He also has an 11th book, a poetry collection that will be published later this year. Jill Becker is going to send through the center everybody that's been invited to this program the links to Patrick's website and his books after this presentation. Well, anyway, in short, Patrick T. Reardon is a most interesting guy with an eclectic interest. But I should also say electric interests. As Patrick tells us about an iconic Chicago presence, the Loop, the L tracks that shaped and saved Chicago. Patrick, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. Let me get my screen sharing going here so we can, okay. First of all, there are a lot of Patrick Reardons who are writers. That's what I've discovered in my life. It's a popular name for anybody who's of Irish descent, and a lot of Irish are filled with blarney, and some of them actually write about it. So this is a book that I've done. It's got a lot of facts in it, no blarney, just a lot of facts and a lot of stories. The Loop, the L tracks that shaped and saved Chicago. A lot of people look at the cover and think, well, this is a story, a transportation book. You know, it's a story about how do the L's work? You know, how do what are the different cars that have been used and the different gauges and things like that. And what's really important for me to admit at the beginning is, as Ron said, I worked at the Tribune for 32 years. I know a lot about Chicago history, but I'm not a transportation expert. This book was not planned. I didn't come into this because I wanted to write a transportation book. This book is an outgrowth of all the work I did at the Tribune about the city, the history of the city, and how the development of the city, and why the city is the way the city is. And so the subhead here, the L tracks that shaped and saved Chicago, that was the key finding of my research when I finally started focusing on this. I had been planning a different book. I'd been planning a book that had to do with the history of Chicago told through the stories of individual people. But I decided at the beginning that I needed to know where the name The Loop came from for Chicago's downtown, because everybody talks about downtown and the I needed to figure that out because there was a debate about it. So I went in to try to figure out the answer to the debate. And when figuring that out, I found a much more important finding. And that basically I argue in my book that the elevated loop is the most important structure in Chicago's history. And that there are three reasons for that. One is because of the loop, the elevated loop, Chicago could go from one end of the city to the other easily through all the different L tracks, L lines that serve the city. Prior to the elevated loop, they would come downtown and there was no easy way to get from one to the other. The second one is that it had a big impact on Chicago's character. And Chicago's a city that's very divided in very many ways. And the elevated loop designated the downtown as a common center, as everybody's second neighborhood. Now, there's an asterisk to that, in as much as African Americans were not as welcomed in the downtown during the early part of the 20th century. So it was a great place for them to get jobs, but not a place where they could get service as much as whites could. So, but still, the elevated loop made the downtown an important place. And the third thing is that the elevated loop designated the richest property in the city. So there was so much investment in the downtown that when the suburbanization happened in the 60s and 70s, when so many cities became ghost towns, Cleveland, Detroit, Omaha, Phoenix, all of those downtowns became empty, Chicago was able to withstand that threat, and in fact have a downtown that's even stronger than it used to be. Now the question is, after COVID, and hopefully we'll get to some point after COVID, how will the loop bounce back? But that's a question for the future. For right now, there's no question that the elevated loop really made Chicago a very strong place. And when I looked at how did the downtown become called the loop, what I discovered was that there was actually a transition that took place over the course of a 15-year period. The downtown was described, because the elevated loop was so significant, was so physically imposing, the downtown was right away, people talked about buildings or places within the district marked off by the Union Loop. And that got to be kind of a mouthful. So they started talking about it as lying within the Union Loop. And then it moved to within the loop, meaning within the circle of the tracks, and then in the Loop District, and finally by 1912 in the Loop. So there was this progression, and it's important because it shows how significant the elevated loop was, but it also is significant because of the kind of bad history that has been promulgated by historians over the past 50 years, which I'll get to in a little bit. I love this map. This is a map from about 1898, just a year after the elevated loop was built. And it shows this is the loop that as we live with it. 75% of the elevated loop, if you go downtown and look at the elevated loop, 75% of the structure is original. So 75% of the structure is 124 years old. And it circled this area, and you can recognize City Hall is still where it was. The government building that was under construction here is now the site of the Kluzinski building. The Board of Trade was over here, and the financial section is already there. let me read to you a section, a couple paragraphs from my book that gives you a sense of, by 1911, what Chicago was and how important the elevated loop was. In 1911, Chicago, described by one Japanese visitor as almost a baby city, is the capital of Middle America, the link between East and West, a manufacturing Goliath, the center of the nation's meat processing industry, home of great American writers, headquarters of Jane Addams and the settlement house movement she invigorated, the railroad nexus of the United States. Chicago is the heart of the nation, and the heart of Chicago is the Loop. The proper name, Loop, often not capitalized before 1950, is a complex term of great importance in Chicago with several meanings, all interconnected. Loop refers to the set of elevated railroad tracks officially known as the Union Loop that form a 2.1-mile long rectangle around the most important and expensive real estate in the city. These tracks run at the second-story level of buildings, more than 20 feet above Van Buren, Wells, and Lake Streets and Wabash Avenue. Dubbed the Golden Circle by its promoters, this loop of tracks has turned out to be all that and more. At this moment in 1911, the elevated loop has been in existence for only 14 years, but has already begun to shape Chicago in myriad ways, the most important of which is rooting the city's central business district in a minuscule site that covers roughly 1,000th of the city's landscape. Later, a critic from New York City will scoff at how congested Chicago's downtown is in comparison to Manhattan, how constrained it is by the elevated tracks. But in mid-century, this will be the salvation of the central business district and the city. More than ever before, Chicago's downtown has become the crossroads of the city because of the elevated loop. It has become in a profound new way the one place where the people of the south, west, and north sides come together, where rich and poor come together, where Chicagoans come together. Now, I want to, this is another, I love this one. This is again from 1898, and you can see how the rail lines coming into the downtown from the south and west, how they were linked by the elevated loop. The north side ones, which would be coming from the right, that had not been completed yet, that line, but when it was completed, it would come across here and link here. I want to explain that, as I said at the beginning, I'm not a transportation expert, and this really isn't a transportation book, although it's talking about a transportation system. In fact, it's talking about two transportation systems. It's talking about the elevated loops and the cable car system. Basically, my book is a real odd book, and I'm a fan of odd books. Here are 6 odd books that were kind of like models for me in terms of wanting to do something that was different. Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice was the beginning of romantic comedies. It is this wonderful breakthrough in a way to tell a story that had very few models before that. William Cronin's book, Nature's Metropolis, is the best book about Chicago, and it's about the 19th century and how Chicago became so great by basically harvesting the environment of the Midwest and then serving as the connecting point between the East and the West. W.D. Du Bois' The Souls of Black Folk was this wonderful breakthrough book, an African-American writing about African-Americans, and not just any African-American, but the African-American who helped found the study of sociology. Lincoln at Gettysburg is Gary Wills writing about the actual speech that Lincoln gave and what it meant and how significant it was, specifically line by line. Evan Cannell's novel, it's not a novel, it's a nonfiction book, but he uses a novelist's techniques about Custer at the Last Stand. And the wonderful thing about this is, it's about Custer, but Custer doesn't appear in the book until page 100. In other words, Cannell is using the early part of the book to set the stage for the appearance of his central character. And then Robert Caro's book, The Power Broker, about Robert Moses and the fall of New York, is the best book ever written about an American city. And it is, all of these were models for me to try to tell a story that was more than a surface story. I've gotten some complaints about my book that it went off in tangents. Well, it's not a book about tangents. It's an odd book because it covers so much stuff. It covers how the downtown has been this central place in the history of Chicago for almost 125 years. And in fact, every New Year's Eve, people would crowd State and Randolph to celebrate. And many of you in the audience were probably among those who were down there one of those years, or many of those years, to celebrate New Year's Eve. It was such a rich place that you can see over here in the bottom left. The black area is the elevated loop, but the red and the green areas are areas that real estate guys wanted to extend the loop because that would make their property even more valuable. So I talk a lot about the real estate values and why the elevated loop was so significant. And then here are two really wonderfully larger than life characters. Charles Tyson Yerkes, who you may have heard of. He's been demonized in Chicago history as the most corrupt businessman the city has ever seen. And there's no question he was corrupt, but he was also a visionary, and a transportation visionary, and his transportation savvy is what got the elevated loop built. And then he left Chicago after being threatened with lynching. That's another story, which I'll probably get into. He goes to London, and he is the key figure in the development of the London Tube, the Underground, which at the time he got there, there were only 2 lines, and they didn't go through the center of the city. When he left, 4 more lines were in the process of being built, and London today would be a much different place if it weren't for Charles Yerkes, as Chicago would be a different place. And the guy next to him, John Alexander Low Waddell, and you can see he's a wacky, big egoed guy. I love the hair here, which at the top of his head, which looks like it's from the Munchkins in The Wizard of Oz. But he was this major world famous engineer, bridge engineer, and he's the one who designed the elevated loop. There are virtually no references to him in any Chicago history book, and I tried in my book to counterbalance, or to give him his due. He was a hugely interesting guy and a really talented guy, and it's too bad that we don't have more about him. I put in as much as I could, but there's he deserves a book of his own. Now, in doing my book, my odd Chicago book, I used a whole range of other books as background. And in a way, what I'm telling you is this is how a writer goes about writing a book, and that writers go to sources. And the sources here, for example, Bruce Moffat's book, The L, this was the Bible in terms of the transportation stuff. Bruce is this transportation expert who just retired from the CTA, and his book was exceedingly helpful with specific dates and numbers and things like that. But my book is not just about the numbers and those sorts of things. I was going after the meaning and the spirit of what the elevated loop brought to Chicago. And so A.J. Liebling's Second City was a wonderful book because it made, he makes tremendous fun of Chicago. He is teasing Chicago constantly in the book. And yet he recognizes that the elevated loop was a significant symbol of the city and that people had an affection for it. Same thing with Nelson Algren's City on the Make, which, by the way, City on the Make and Second City by Liebling came out within a year of each other. And Algren's City on the Make, which is a huge prose poem about Chicago, was this wonderful document to help me get a sense of the city. And he talks about the elevated loop as the rusty heart of Chicago. Similarly, Building Lives by Neil Harris at the University of Chicago was a significant book for me because it talks about structures having life the way a person does, and there's a birth and a death, and there is an effect on the people around these structures. And so this was a real helpful book. As was Carol Willis's book, Form Follows Finance, which compares the Chicago skyscrapers with the New York City skyscrapers, and that was a real big help. Robert Barron, of course, about Charles Yerkes. This is the biography of Yerkes. Alan Trachtenberg's book on the Brooklyn Bridge was a significant book, as we'll get into in just a minute, because I compare the elevated loop to the Brooklyn Bridge, and as much as they don't look alike, they really are very similar in a lot of ways. Banfield's book on political influence was significant in one of my chapters because it talks about an attempt to build a new downtown north of the river in the 1940s or 1950s. An effort that fell flat because Mayor Daley walked away from it, the first Mayor Daley. Although he comes into play later with attempts to tear down the elevated. Chicago Cable Cars by Greg Borso was real important, as was Industrial Archaeology by Theodore Anton Sandy. So I'm talking about these books because they're odd books. They give a sense that the story of the elevated loop is not just a transportation story. It's about how we feel about it, how we think about it, and what it's meant to us. Now, these books are examples of the reason I ended up getting into this subject. I wanted to figure out where did the downtown get its name as loop? Well, I look at history books, and there have been dozens of history books, starting with George Hilton's Cable Railways of Chicago, including Robert Spinney's book, Donald Miller's City of the Century, one of the best-selling books about Chicago history of all time. And all of them say the downtown got its name, the loop, from cable car loops. Well, if you grew up in Chicago or around Chicago, as I did, I always understood, well, the downtown got its name from the elevated loop. It goes around the loop and it's the loop, right? Well, no, they're telling us, no, we were wrong. It wasn't. So what I did first of all was to take their books and start looking at what their sources were. And most of their sources didn't go anywhere. But in looking at their sources and looking at lots of other sources, I was able to find lots of wonderful stuff. Now, for example, in Harold Mayer and Richard Wade's book, Chicago Growth of a Metropolis, which is a wonderful, wonderful, great book about Chicago, they have a passing reference to, if the most noisy place is hell, surely Chicago must be hell, a bewildered Japanese visitor wrote in 1900. Well, I wanted to see more of what else did this Japanese visitor write or say. and after some research, and it wasn't real clear, but I eventually got to the story of Yoni Noguchi, told by himself, illustrated by Yoshio Markino. And from that, I was able to get a number of really good quotes from him. Japanese poet Yoni Noguchi was astonished upon arrival in the city in 1900. "Oh Lord, what is that overflowing in the sky, that flood of blackness?" A Chicagoan said, "That's merely a smoke." "A smoke, you say? Merely a smoke that divorces the sun from its flower, that shuts out heaven from the sight of men?" Smoke means Chicago as flower means Japan. I mean, this is a wonderful thing to find when I was looking into this, partly because it tells us what it felt like to be in Chicago, because this outsider's coming in and looking at this, at what was around us and was around the people that time. But he didn't just say that. He says, "Chicago is the noisiest city in America. Indeed, if the most noisy place is hell, surely Chicago is hell." So that is the one quote that was used by Mayer and Wade. And by looking at the sources, deeper at the sources, I was able to get more information. I also used the Chicago Tribune as the Tribune is the only Chicago newspaper that has a continuous archive of every daily paper going back to the 1850s. And so I was able to use that to track how the word loop and L loop and union loop were used. And that was a key, that's available through the Chicago Public Library as an online database. So I looked at thousands of Tribune stories to look at how was the word loop used. So this is part of my going back to the sources. I also went to books of that era, The Cliff Dwellers. It's about living in or having an office, I believe, in a skyscraper. That was from 1893. And Sister Carrie, of course, from 1900, The Plan of Chicago from 1909. None of them mention the cable car. None of them mentioned that the downtown was being called the Loop at the time they were written. And obviously, if especially the Cliff Dwellers, because the downtown was so important, if it had been called the Loop, that was a likely time where it was going to be used. Finally, another great example of sources. This is Clarence Darrow. This is his law partner, the guy who wrote Spoon River Anthology. And I'm blanking on his name right now. Well, how could I blank on his name? Anyway, these two guys in their memoirs, Edgar Lee Masters. These two guys in their memoirs both wrote about being in the downtown area in around 1895, 1896. And they talked about walking through the area that was later called the Loop. So they were saying that it was not called the Loop until after the elevated loop was built. Now here's this is from my book, but I first saw a map like this in Greg Borzo's book, and these are the maps of the cable car loops. So you can see the cable car would come down here, would swing around this way, and then come back and go south. And so that was one loop. There's the second loop, the third loop, a fourth loop, a fifth loop, and a sixth loop. So there are 6 loops. So, and these were the first of these loops came in 1882, and these 6 were all there by about 1893, I believe. Which of these would be circling the downtown? None of these circle the downtown. And so how would the downtown get the name loop from these 6 small loops? Especially when you put the elevated loop around it, you see that it really doesn't, these small loops don't mean anything, whereas the big loop really says something. It's very imposing. It's very it's hard to ignore, and it does include the downtown. So, to go back to what I mentioned at the beginning, the downtown was not called the Loop until after the elevated loop was built, and there was this progression of usage until finally it got named the Loop. And this is not surprising because this happens all the time with very significant structures. If you've been to New York, you've probably seen the Flatiron Building. Well, the Flatiron Building was built by the Fuller Company. And the Fuller Company was building this building, which was designed, by the way, by Daniel Burnham of Chicago. The Fuller Company was building this building as kind of an advertisement for itself. It was going to be called the Fuller Building, except that once it got started, it wasn't finished yet, but people could see what the pattern was, and it was immediately started called the Flatiron Building. And the Fuller Company was really ticked off. But it remained the Flatiron Building because people called it the Flatiron Building. It was called the Flatiron Building because it looked like a flatiron. So this is the way words get used. You've seen Rodin's sculpture of the thinker, right? Well, he didn't call it the thinker. He called it Dante, or the poet, I think. It was people looking at it saying, oh, that's the thinker. Or another one of his sculptures is the Kiss. And he called that something else, but everybody looked at it and said, that's the Kiss. Or to pick something closer to home, how about this? What's this called? Well, it's called the Cloud Gate, right? Except nobody calls it the Cloud Gate. This is the bean because, well, it looks like a bean. And the sculptor of this was not real happy. It was called the bean, at least initially. Later on, he got to the point where he recognized that it's better just to accept it because it wasn't going to change. So the point is that significant structures, significant eye-catching things will lead the public to give them a name. And it's not like all the people in this picture sat down and said, well, what should we call this? Each individual started calling it the Loop. There was probably somebody who called it the bean, called this the bean. Someone called it the bean first, and others heard it, but it wasn't like there was a committee, and it wasn't like the mayor said, we're going to call this the bean, or it wasn't that the sculptor said, we're going to call it the bean. It just was called the bean. And that's how things happen. And that's how it happened with the elevated loop. And it happened with the elevated loop partly because it is so, if you're walking around downtown, there is no street like this one, which is Lake Street. There's no street like the four under the elevated loop, except the four under the elevated loop. In other words, you know that this exists just on the way the pavement looks. Secondly, this is only 20 feet above the street, but it's still looming over you when you're walking across or driving under. And even if you're not under it, you can look at it and you see it right there. Thirdly, it is loud, and it's not as loud as it used to be, but the wheels used to squeal and the cars would rumble, and it was just hard to not notice. If you're downtown and you're standing over here on the sidewalk and the train comes by, you have to stop your conversation because no one can hear anybody until the train goes by. So what I'm saying is this physical thing was so imposing, and then on top of that, it was so important in terms of real estate values and changing the values of land inside and outside. And so important because it made the downtown the center of the city in a way it hadn't been as much before. That's why it got called the Loop, why the downtown got called the Loop, because this structure was so imposing. And here's an example, as I pointed this out earlier in a quick thing. Here's the elevated loop. And if you were inside the loop, if you had land inside the loop, you were golden. You just had a great your land was really worth a lot. But if you were right outside the elevated tracks, it was worth a lot less. So real estate guys for about 20 years kept proposing, well, let's move it, let's move the elevated loop down to Polk Street. We'll just, extend the tracks on the east side and then put one here, or extend the tracks to Taylor. Well, what that would do would be to take this piece of land here and make it a lot more valuable than it is right now, or this piece of land, or this piece of land down here. So this was this kind of constant calling for an extension of the loop was an example of how significant the elevated loop was within the business community, the real estate community in the city. So again, it was the most important structure. It is the most important structure in the city because it impacted the city's transportation, the city's character, and the city's economic strength. Now here's the Brooklyn Bridge. This is, if you've ever been to New York, the Brooklyn Bridge is a beautiful, beautiful structure. Not only is it massive and muscular, but it's elegant. It's got these arches here that it makes it look like it's a cathedral. It's just a wonderful piece of engineering, and you can see it from all over. If you're flying in New York, you can see it. And if you look here, all of this development on the Manhattan side, it's a very significant place for Manhattan that the bridge connects to from Brooklyn. And here's the elevated loop in Chicago. Look at how dinky it looks. It's like nothing. If you're looking at this from an airplane, you're not seeing the elevated loop. In fact, I don't know that anyone can ever see the whole elevated loop in one shot. I've thought, and I actually looked at Google Maps to see if their satellite shots could get all of the elevated loop if you've got high enough and you're over the right way. But I think with the shadows of the building, you're never going to see it. So this looks really dinky, whereas the Brooklyn Bridge looks huge, right, and wonderful. But here, look at this. All right, the Brooklyn Bridge connects to Manhattan, and look at how short those buildings were when it was built. So all those buildings went up because the Brooklyn Bridge brought traffic to this area. And so that built up this whole area of Manhattan, at the south end of Manhattan. So here's what, excuse these maps, these are real kind of sloppy, kind of just grabbing photos and just making pictures. But if you look at Manhattan, you've got all of this area down here at the south end that is in large part because of the Brooklyn Bridge bringing people into Brooklyn. So the Brooklyn Bridge helped make Manhattan, it helped make this land real valuable. It also helped connect Manhattan to Brooklyn, which made possible made easier the unification of the boroughs into the greater Manhattan. And it also made this area a significant protection for Manhattan against suburbanization when it came in the future. But this part of Manhattan is one central business district. There's a second central business district up near Central Park. So you've got these two central business districts. And in fact, if you ask a New Yorker, where's the downtown? They won't know. There is no downtown. There are two central business districts, but there's no center of the city. I guess you could argue that all of Manhattan is the center of the city, but that's a kind of a big place to be the center of the city. Look here at Chicago, and I love the winter part of this, but Chicago's center is clear. It's right here. There is, if you go further north along the lakefront and south, there's high rises, but nothing like the concentration you get here. And here's an example, a better example. This is a Google map that I played with, and the elevated loop would be in this area here, and that's where the high rises were being built right inside and right around it, and then it extended out all the way up north to North Avenue, and all the way out west almost to Wells, and then down here across the river. So you've got this tremendous center of Chicago with all these high rises, and the reason that they're anchored on the elevated loop. They go back for 125 years to the elevated loop, which itself circled an area that already had some skyscrapers, but the elevated loop helped make even more of those skyscrapers, or attract more skyscrapers. Finally, I'm going to end here and then take questions, and then I can go into some other stuff if we still have time at the end. But I love this picture on the left here, partly because of the guy with the bowler hat. I mean, how can you not like a bowler hat? Because you don't see those at all anymore. But this is the elevated loop. This is the Long Wabash. Well, so this was in 1906, I think. So in 2014, I went out to the same place, almost the same spot. I think I would have had to stand on Monroe or Adams or whatever to get the exact same spot. But you can see many of the same buildings. This building here is here. This building here is here. This building is here. This building is here. And as I said before, the elevated loop structure, 75% of this in this picture, or 75% of this is still in this picture. What's happened is over time, there were efforts to tear down the elevated loop for 80 years. And in the 70s, it came close to getting torn down. It was, it got saved. And since then, since the late 70s, the elevated loop has been seen as this character, the structure that kind of symbolizes the character of the city. It is a structure that no other city has in the world, and its grit and its strength and its muscularity really seem to embody Chicago, and maybe perhaps its elegance in an inelegant way. I'm not sure if that's the best way to say it, but it's been a wonderful, important structure for Chicago, and it has really shaped Chicago, and as I argue in my book, it has saved Chicago. So I'm going to stop right here and just see what kind of questions you have, and then I can add stuff on at the end if we still have time.
Patrick, this is Ron. That was just marvelous. Kay and I both were just so interested in what you had to say. And more importantly, how you went about it. I mean, it was amazing. You definitely have put your skills together in such a perfect way. You may want to stop the screen share or put another screen on it. Okay, Kay made light happen. Thank you, Kay. The question, I'm going to hold my question to just one. I had a couple, but I think you covered one of them. I grew up on the west side of Chicago between Holman and Harrison, and was raised by my immigrant grandparents, and in their backyard was the elevated. We lived on the second floor, and the noise that we heard was pretty common. My question is this, relating to that, my grandfather was an electrician, and this was I was born in the 40s, and he was an electrician with the CTA. Chicago Transit Authority. What role did immigrants, he was an Italian immigrant, could hardly speak English, but he had a fairly good income being an electrician. What role did immigrants play in building the elevated?
I can say that the immigrants were doing all the labor that everybody was doing, that was needed to be done. So immigrants played this huge role, and they were the laborers who were the ones digging up around on those streets to put in the girders and all that, and they were the guys who stood on the sidewalk and heated up the iron pieces or steel pieces that they would throw to a guy up at the top who would catch it in like a catcher's glove and put
ingots.
it in to make rivets. Yes. And so they were the ones, it was all immigrants. I don't have specifics on which immigrant groups. By this point, a lot of the politicians were Irish, but there were still a lot of Irish laborers. So laborers, it was good paying work, and so a lot of them were getting good jobs. I suspect, given that Chicago is what Chicago was, a lot of them probably had to know somebody to get those jobs. But the thing to remember too is those were not public jobs. The elevated loop was privately built. It was built. Charles Yerkes built it in crafty and somewhat devious ways. He built each section separately with a separate company, but the city, or it didn't become a public agency till the CTA was created in the 40s, I believe. But again, this is a time when all those sorts of things, the cable cars, and then later the streetcars and the elevated lines were all privately owned.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm going to turn it over to Jill because there's some questions that she wants to cover for us.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Ron, and thanks, Patrick. That was really interesting. The first one's from Rosalie, and she says, I think she's referencing the first map that you showed in the screen share. I don't see Wabash on the map. Was it on the original route or was it added later?
What was that again? I didn't quite get it.
I don't see Wabash on the map.
Oh, Wabash.
Wabash on the map.
Yeah, Wabash,
was it the original route?
Yeah, Wabash is the original route. Yeah, and it's on the. It may have been covered up by the tracks, but yeah, Wabash. In fact, Wabash is where one of the. In each of the four places, Yerkes had to get the permission of the property owners to put an L track on the street in front of them, and so they demanded bribes, and the Illinois Supreme Court said you can't do that, but they did it anyway. So Wabash was there, and that's one of the places where the property owners held up Yerkes and got money from them in a corrupt way.
Thank you. Bob says, you said the loop was a sort of crossroads for all people of Chicago. He grew up in the city and rode the L into the loop many times, working as an usher in the B&K movie theaters, etc. I don't believe I ever saw a person of color in the loop who wasn't an employee of some service organization. So that's Bob's comment. Yeah,
no, he's right. And that was a thing that I should have covered in the book, and I didn't, and I apologize for that. But as I said at the beginning of this presentation, it was the center of the city with an asterisk that for the first 30 or 40 years, African Americans of the 20th century, African Americans were not able to get full service there. There were ways. They actually, I've talked to one guy whose family would go to the opera, and they could get in the opera, even though they were African Americans. But they couldn't go to Marshall Fields unless they were light-skinned. And the light-skinned African Americans who were able to get into Marshall Fields would come home and brag about how they were able to go to Marshall Fields. But essentially, it was an example of American racism for a long time. In fact, there were in the 60s there were sit-ins at some downtown restaurants in order to get them to open up as for African Americans.
Thank you. William says or asks, what does the Union part of Union Loop mean?
Well, there's two answers for that in a way. First of all, you got to remember this is in 1897, so the Civil War was only done 32 years earlier, and one of the significant political blocks of the time was the Union. What was it called? It was Union veterans, and they formed a block and they had their own organization. So Union was a very positive word. In fact, there were a lot of ways in which Union was used. So that was a nice term to put on the loop, and it was all it fit because the Union Loop was going to unite the South. The elevated line from the south and the two from the west, and ultimately the one from the north. So it was going to unite these. So it was a union loop. It was going to union fit that. It could have been called amalgamated. It could have been called a bunch of other stuff like that. But Union was a short enough name, and it had this historic positive element to it.
Thanks. Someone asks, did the demise of the stockyards help or hurt Chicago?
Well, that is a little outside. That's a lot outside my book, but I think the demise of the stockyards is an example of a place that had an impact. The way that the elevated structure had an impact, the way that the highways had an impact. So the loss of the stockyards over time meant a loss of jobs, the same way that the loss of the steel mills meant a loss of jobs. So I don't think you can ever argue that it wasn't a good thing. On the other hand, the smell on the south side is certainly not as bad as it was during the stockyard times. But I mean, I think there's no argument that if the stockyards, that the loss of the stockyards was a financial problem for the city.
He also asked, what street is the south end of the loop?
It's Van Buren.
Van Buren. Okay, thank you. Another person asked, what other cities have elevated train tracks?
Well, very few. New York does. If you're going in New York, you get on the subway and you're going to Yankee Stadium. There is one subway that goes underground the whole way, but there's another subway that comes up out of the ground, so you can come toward Yankee Stadium on an L. But their elevated trains in Manhattan, their elevated tracks were taken down in the 30s. Which was one of the arguments that Chicago should do it because New York did it. Boston had elevated trains, and they're gone. There were some other cities, but I'm not remembering them offhand. I don't think there was a lot of this in Europe, but certainly very few cities still have any kind of elevated tracks like this. And none have ever had an elevated loop like Chicago. There are some that have tinier little circles through their downtown, but they are only serving downtown. They don't connect to the rest of the city.
There's a couple more questions. One is, what did it cost to ride the L? I guess then when it was built.
I think it was a nickel. but I don't hold me to that. I think it was a nickel, which sounds like nothing today, but that was not nothing.
Yeah. And how come the L fell off the tracks? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Oh, well, no, that's it. That was not the L, or this happened in 1977. And it was not a problem with the tracks or the trains, if you will. What happened was coming north on Wabash, a train came into toward the Lake Street station and stopped because there was already a car in, or a train in there. So it was stopped, and the train behind it kept coming, and the driver, it was the driver's fault. The driver failed to put on the brakes, and so the second train hit the first train in the back. And because the first train didn't give, in other words, its brakes worked, so the second train buckled, and the buckling is what led it to fall off the tracks. In other words, the tracks worked fine, the structure worked fine, the trains worked fine. It was the problem that the driver ran into the car ahead of him. And 11 people died and 100 plus were injured. So it was not, it was a really bad thing. And it almost helped the people who wanted to tear down the elevated loop. It almost helped bring that about.
So thank you. I see no more questions. And thank you, Patrick. Over to Ron.
Yes, so Patrick, I know that you have more to say, and I want to tell the audience here a couple things about that. Number one, we really appreciate the approach that Patrick takes. We learned a lot. There's even more to learn. So there's definitely going to be, Jill will be sharing the links to both the books that Patrick has written and his website, which I found very interesting. She's going to send that to everybody within the day or two. So look for that, those of on the call. Secondly, Patrick, I want to thank you in this way. The Ken Burns approach that you kind of take to a subject is wonderful. And I'm sure that there are other topics that you and I can talk about and I can bring to the programs committee for their consideration. So I'm hoping that you like this experience, and that maybe when we are back, we can honor the invite that we gave to you initially, that you could come to the center and meet the people, and we could meet you in person. We're all looking forward to that. But I want to just say thank you on behalf of the North Shore Senior Center Tuesday Club. Thank you, Patrick.
Well, thank you very much, and I'd love to be there in person sometime to talk about whatever.